Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Filzah Nur Akila binti Khairul Fauzi. My metric number is 1250025. Now, I would like to present a landmark constitutional case in Malaysia, namely Cik Omar bin Cik So versus Public Prosecutor 1988 to Malaysian Law Journal 55. This case is one of the most significant decisions in Malaysian constitutional law because it clarified the interpretation of Article 3 of the Federal Constitution and the constitutional position of Islam within Malaysian legal system. First, let us begin with the overview of the case. The appellants in this case were Cik Omar bin Cik So in Criminal Appeal Number 28 of 1986 and Wal Jalil bin Wan Abdul Rahman together with another appellant in Criminal Appeal Number 29 of 1986. On the other hand, the respondent was the public prosecutor. The case was heard before the Supreme Court of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur on the 60th of December 1987 and the 29th of February 1988. The panel judges consisted of Saleh Abbas, who was the Lord President, together with Wan Sulaiman, Sayyid Hashim Yok'e, Sani and Said Agil Barokba. As for legal representation, S. Siva Subramanian appeared for the appellant in Appeal Number 28 of 1986. Meanwhile, T. Muraraju and Ramdas Tikamdas represented the appellants in Appeal Number 29 of 1986. The respondent was represented by Deputy Public Prosecutors Muhammad Nur Haji Ahmad and Zaini Haji Abdul Rahman. I will explain the objective and background of this case. The objective of the appeal was to introduce an additional ground of appeal in order to challenge the mandatory death sentence imposed on the appellants. They argued that the punishment was contrary to the principles of Islamic law and therefore unconstitutional under the Federal Constitution. As for the background facts, the appellants had already been sentenced to mandatory death penalties under written civil laws. Since Criminal Appeal Number 28 of 1986 and Criminal Number 29 of 1986 involve similar constitutional issues as well as similar arguments relating to Islamic law, both appeals were consolidated and heard together by the Supreme Court. Now, let us move on the facts of the case. The appellants were convicted of offences under the Dangerous Drug Act 1952 for drug trafficking and the Firearms Increased Penalty Act 1971. Under both acts, the offences carried mandatory sentence upon conviction. The defence argued that Islam is recognised as the religion of the Federation under Article 3, Clause 1 of the Federal Constitution, while Article 4, Clause 1 provides that the Federal Constitution is the supreme law of the Federation. Based on these constitutional provisions, the appellants claim that any law which contradicts Islamic principles should be regarded as unconstitutional. They further argued that the mandatory civil death penalty imposed under these acts did not fall within the Islamic categories of hudud or qisas. Therefore, they contended that the punishment was invalid and unconstitutional under the Federal Constitution. So, the next slide discusses the legal issue before the court. The first issue was whether the mandatory death penalty imposed under the Dangerous Drugs Act 1952 and the Firearms Increased Penalties Act 1971 was constitutional. The second issue was whether the mandatory death penalty was contrary to Islamic injunction because it did not fall within the recognised categories of hudud or qisas under Islamic law. Finally, the third one, the court had to determine whether such punishment was invalid under Article 3, 4 and 162 of the Federal Constitution, particularly concerning the constitutional positions of Islam and the validity of the existing laws in Malaysia. Now, let us look at the court's judgment on the first legal issue. The Supreme Court interpreted the word Islam and the religion of Islam in Article 3 according to their constitutional meaning rather than their theological meaning. The court held that the reference to Islam in Article 3 mainly relates to religious practices, rituals and ceremonies. It does not mean that Islamic law automatically becomes the supreme law of the country. Therefore, Article 3 cannot be used to invalidate the mandatory death penalty or any other law enacted by Parliament merely because it is alleged to be inconsistent with Islamic principles. Moving on to the court's conclusion, firstly, the court held that the Article 3 could not be relied upon as a basis to argue that the mandatory death penalty for drug trafficking or other offences was unconstitutional. The court also explained that the term Islam in Article 3 does not elevate Islamic law to become the supreme law of the Federation. Secondly, the court referred to Article 162 of the Federal Constitution, which preserved the continuity of the existing secular laws that were already enforced before the Constitution came into operation. Therefore, the mandatory death penalty provided under the relevant acts remain legally valid and enforceable. Lastly, although the court acknowledged that Islam is generally understood as a complete way of life, it reaffirmed that the legal system currently operating in Malaysia is based on secular law. The court also found that the appellant's argument were inconsistent with the Civil Law Act 1956, which provides for the reception of English common law into the Malaysian legal system. The next slide explains the factual analysis conducted by the court. The judges carefully examined the historical development of Malaysian law before reaching their decision. They observed that before British intervention, the Sultan of each Malay state served not only as the religious leaders but also as the political ruler. During that period, Islamic law was generally the applicable law and the Sultan was regarded as God's vicegerent on earth. However, following British interventions through agreements such as the Pangkor Treaty, the administrative system gradually changed into a secular system based on indirect rule. As a result, sovereignty and legal authority shifted from Islamic governance to a secular legal system established by the British administration. Consequently, Islamic law became limited mainly to personal matters affecting Muslims, particularly marriage, divorce and inheritance. Based on this historical development, the court concluded that the framers of the Federal Constitution intended the word Islam in Article 3 to reflect this constitutional and historical context, rather than establishing Islam as an all-encompassing legal system governing every aspect of the country's laws. Next is the final decision of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court unanimously dismissed the appellant's arguments. The court emphasized that unless the legal system is changed through appropriate channels such as parliament, public policy or legislative reform, the courts are bound to continue applying the existing civil laws. Accordingly, the mandatory death sentences imposed under the relevant acts remain valid, constitutional and enforceable. Finally, I would like to conclude my presentation. The case of Cik Omar bin Cik So versus Public Prosecutor remains one of the most important constitutional decisions in Malaysia. It clearly established that although Islam is recognized as the religion of the Federation under Article 3 of the Federal Constitution, Malaysia's general criminal and civil legal system remains secular and is based on laws enacted by Parliament. The court further clarified that any proposal to transform Malaysia into a fully Islamic legal system cannot be achieved through judicial interpretation. Instead, such reforms must be made through the legislative process in Parliament. This case, therefore, continues to serve as an important precedent in understanding the constitutional position of Islam and the separation between constitutional interpretation and legislative reform in Malaysia. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. I hope I will get full mark. Thank you, Doctor. Yeah.